Russia did not only invade Ukraine. It appeared to bet that Ukraine would break. The government would run. The army would fracture. The public would accept the new reality. That bet failed. To understand why, remember the spine of the first two parts. Part 1 explained the older argument. Shared history is real. But shared history is not ownership. Part 2 showed how independence, the Budapest Memorandum, NATO ambiguity, Maidan, Crimea, Donbass, and Minsk turned politics into war. Now the story reaches the morning everyone feared. In late 2021 and early 2022, Russian forces built up near Ukraine. The Kremlin published historical arguments claiming Russians and Ukrainians were one people. Russia demanded security arrangements from the West, including limits on NATO. Diplomats talked. Warnings grew. For weeks, the world watched satellite images like weather maps before a hurricane. Tanks gathered, military logistics expanded, equipment moved. Medical preparations were reported. Ukrainians packed emergency bags and also went to work, because life cannot pause forever for a threat that may or may not arrive. Inside Ukraine, people watched the world debate their future as if the country were a chessboard. Then February 24th, 2022. Before sunrise, phones lit up, missiles flew, aircraft moved, columns of armor crossed into Ukraine from multiple directions. From Russia, from occupied Crimea, from Belarus. In his address, Vladimir Putin used the language of security, NATO, demilitarization, and denazification. But the military reality was bigger than a narrow security operation. Russian forces moved toward Kyiv. They struck cities. They tried to break the Ukrainian state. The UN General Assembly later condemned Russia's aggression and demanded withdrawal. The legal and moral center is clear. Russia invaded Ukraine. The next question is why Russia expected it might work. Part of the answer is power. Russia was larger. Its military was feared. Ukraine had corruption problems. Ukraine had regional differences. Ukraine had already lost Crimea and parts of Donbass. Some in Moscow seemed to believe the Ukrainian state was hollow, that once pressure came, the government would flee, the army would fragment, and many people would accept a new reality. Russia may have misread Ukraine in 4 ways. It confused Russian language with Russian loyalty. It confused corruption with the absence of statehood. It confused political division with national collapse. It confused shared history with willingness to be ruled. It also underestimated what 8 years of war had already changed. Since 2014, Ukraine had been forced to learn under pressure. Its army was still imperfect. Its state was still imperfect. But it was not the same country that had been shocked by Crimea. Soldiers had combat experience. Volunteers had built supply networks. Civil society had learned how to move faster than bureaucracy. Local governments had learned how to keep services running through crisis. Ukraine's cooperation with Western partners had deepened, especially after Russia's 2014 seizure of Crimea. And millions of people had spent 8 years watching what Russian-backed war did to parts of Donbass. That experience did not make Ukraine invincible. It made the idea of easy collapse much weaker than Moscow appeared to believe. But that assumption ran into the one thing imperial thinking often misses. People who are treated as objects may understand themselves as citizens. Ukraine did not collapse. The government stayed in Kyiv. That mattered before any battlefield map changed. If the government had fled, surrender might have started to look inevitable. Instead, the center held long enough for the rest of the country to organize. The army fought. Territorial defense units formed. ordinary people made roadblocks, carried supplies, documented attacks, moved families, repaired power systems, and kept institutions alive. Railway stations became escape routes. Apartment basements became shelters. Classrooms and offices became supply rooms. Repair crews went back out after strikes because electricity, water, and heat were not abstractions. They were survival. So the answer to why Ukraine did not collapse is not one heroic image. It is a system. A president who stayed, an army that fought, citizens who organized, railways that moved people and supplies, local officials who kept working, external support that grew as Ukraine proved it could survive, and a national identity strong enough to include people who spoke different languages, lived in different regions, and disagreed about politics. For the family in the hallway, sovereignty was not a word from international law. It was whether the person deciding their future lived in their country or arrived in a tank. The early defense of Kyiv became a symbol. So did Kharkiv. So did Mariupol. So did towns whose names became known because civilians suffered there and because soldiers fought there. Then the war changed shape. It did not become one long repeated battle. It moved through phases. First came the failed rapid seizure of Kyiv. Russia's plan appeared to depend on speed, shock, and political collapse. But Kyiv did not fall. That changed the first assumption of the war. Ukraine was not going to disappear in days. Then Russia shifted more heavily toward the east and south. The war became a fight over cities, roads, rivers, ports, and supply lines. Mariupol and Azovstal became symbols of siege, destruction, and endurance. They showed the cost of the war in one city-sized wound. Ukraine's Kharkiv counteroffensive changed expectations and showed that Russian control was not automatically permanent. It proved occupation could be reversed. Kherson became another marker. A city Russia had taken, then was forced to leave. It showed that a captured city was not the same as a settled border. Then Russia dug in. Mobilization expanded. Defensive lines hardened. Mines, trenches, artillery, and attrition became central. Bakhmut and Avdiivka became names associated with grinding, costly battles. They marked the shift toward attrition, where meters, shells, and manpower became the language of the front. Then drones began to change the feel of the battlefield. Small machines made hiding harder. Cheap weapons threatened expensive equipment. The sky itself became crowded with surveillance and danger. Air defense became a question of civilian survival. That changed the civilian war too. The sky above an apartment block became part of the front line. Energy grid attacks turned electricity, heat, and repair crews into part of the war story. The Black Sea also changed as drones and long-range systems challenged older assumptions about naval power and supply routes. Each phase changed the viewer's question. First, will Ukraine survive? Then, can Ukraine push Russia back? Then, can Russia absorb the cost? Then, can Ukraine and its supporters endure longer than Russia's war machine? By the middle years of the war, the question was no longer only who can win a battle. It was who can endure a system, manpower, factories, air defense, sanctions, repair crews, external support, public patience, civilian resilience. All of it became part of the battlefield. And here is the question many viewers eventually ask. If the war is so terrible, why has it not ended? The answer is not because people enjoy war. The answer is that each side fears the morning after a bad peace. For Ukraine, a bad peace could mean occupied territory becomes permanent. It could mean millions of people remain under Russian control. It could mean Russia pauses, rearms, and attacks again. It could mean the lesson of the war becomes this: if a nuclear-armed state invades, destroys enough, and waits long enough, it gets to keep what it took. That is why many Ukrainians see the war as existential. Not because every Ukrainian wants every maximalist slogan, but because they have already seen what happens when Russia takes territory. They have seen Crimea. They have seen Donbass. They have seen occupation. They have seen filtration, deportation allegations, destroyed cities, and children growing up under another flag. For Russia's leadership, a bad peace has a different meaning. A failed war could expose the limits of Russian power. It could leave Ukraine more anti-Russian, more armed, more tied to the West than before. It could make the invasion look not like restoration, but like a historic mistake. It could threaten the story the Kremlin told its own population, that Russia was defending itself, that Ukraine was not fully real, that the West was using Ukraine, that victory was necessary. Once leaders tell a population that a war is existential, backing away becomes politically dangerous. So, the war continues. Not because the causes are mysterious, because the costs of admitting failure are enormous. There is another reason peace is hard. Trust has been destroyed. Budapest did not protect Ukraine. Minsk did not end the war. Ceasefires were violated, borders were crossed. Promises became arguments about wording. When trust collapses, every peace proposal becomes two questions. What does the paper say? And who enforces it when the paper is broken? That is why Ukraine keeps asking not only for sympathy, but for air defense, weapons, financing, and long-term commitments. That is why Russia keeps trying to shape Western fatigue, because if Ukraine's support weakens, Ukraine's negotiating position weakens too. This is the brutal logic behind a long war. Military pressure is only one front. Time is another. If Russia cannot quickly conquer Ukraine, it can try to outlast Ukraine. If Ukraine cannot quickly expel Russia, it has to make survival durable enough that Russia's theory of victory fails. As of the final fact-check before publication, the war is still active. The exact front lines, casualty figures, aid packages, and negotiation status must be checked again before audio generation and publication. But the broad shape is clear. In the June 24, 2026 production fact-check, the latest UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission monthly update available was May 2026. It reported that at least 274 civilians were killed and 1,763 were injured in Ukraine that month, the highest monthly total of civilians killed and injured since April 2022. Humanitarian agencies continued to track millions of people who fled Ukraine or remained displaced inside it. In the same production check, IOM's 2026 Ukraine Crisis Plan described millions internally displaced, while the UN Humanitarian Response Plan estimated more than 10 million people in need of humanitarian assistance inside Ukraine. UNHCR's Ukraine Refugee Data Portal continued to track millions of refugees recorded across Europe and beyond. And in June 2026, current reporting around the G7 still centered on the same survival questions: air defense, energy resilience, sanctions, financing, whether outside support will last longer than Russia's war effort. Those present tense details can change. The older structure underneath them has not changed. From far away, this is geopolitics. From inside Ukraine, it is whether your city wakes up under your flag or someone else's. Once you see that, the timeline stops looking like disconnected dates. Kyiv and Rus explains why shared origins are so emotionally charged. The imperial centuries explain why Ukraine's identity was repeatedly treated as regional, dangerous, or incomplete. The Soviet century explains why state violence, famine, war, and Russification still shape fear. 1991 explains why Ukraine's independence was a democratic act, not a Western invention. 1994 explains why security assurances feel painfully hollow. 2008 explains the dangerous ambiguity around NATO. 2014 explains why the war did not start in 2022. Minsk explains why a ceasefire without trust could not settle sovereignty. 2022 explains the final break. Russia moved from pressure and proxy war to an open attempt to force Ukraine's future by massive violence. So why did Russia invade Ukraine? Because Russia's leadership saw Ukraine's independent direction as a strategic threat. Because NATO and Western integration became symbols of that threat. Because Ukraine's democracy, however imperfect, kept producing choices Moscow could not fully control. Because the Kremlin's historical worldview treated Ukraine as too close, too important, and too connected to be allowed full independence from Russian power. Because empire often calls itself security. And why did Ukraine resist? Because for Ukrainians, the invasion was not an abstract geopolitical dispute. It was the arrival of someone else's army in their cities. It was the denial of their vote. It was the denial of their state. It was the denial of their future. The simplest version of the story says, Russia wanted Ukraine. Ukraine said no. The deeper version says, Russia and Ukraine share history. Russia's leadership tried to turn that shared history into a claim of control. Ukraine turned its history into a claim of independence. There is a dangerous sentence at the center of many wars. You were always ours. Ukraine's answer has been, we may share a past, but our future is not yours to command. A border can look thin on a map, but sometimes that thin line holds a vote, a language, a graveyard, a memory, a promise, a future. And that is why, before sunrise on February 24, 2022, when the missiles began and the phones lit up, the question was never only, who controls this land? The deeper question was, who gets to decide what Ukraine is? And Ukraine's answer was, us.